Hello, everyone. Sorry for recording this so late, but I'm inspired. Just came back from a beautiful Shabbaton weekend in the Laurentian Mountains together with Elizabeth Shalom and Charlie Goldberg and Rabbi Yoshin Chani Berkowitz and an incredible group of singles from all over the world. I would say it was like a healing retreat. Dating is the hardest job in the world. There's nothing harder than dating. And just to be able to get together and share that space. And for those of you who were there, you know what I'm talking about. It was incredibly inspiring. I love to move on with my sermon now. One of the great questions that I've been thinking a lot about throughout the past few months with this terrible war that's going on in the Middle East is to celebrate or not to celebrate. Do we celebrate while in pain? What do we do? So let me explain. There's a long-standing custom that during each of the summer Shabbats, especially between Passover and Shavuot, we study a chapter of Pirkei Avot. I've spoken about this before. And this past Shabbat, we studied chapter 4. And in chapter 4, in Mishnah 19, it says, Shmuel the Small, he says, and he quotes Proverbs, that when your enemy falls, do not rejoice. And when he stumbles, let your heart not exult. Don't rejoice when you see the downfall of your enemy. It's so easy to be excited when you get your way, when things kind of go according to the way that make you feel like you're on top, like you're up. And so the message is clear. And the proper behavior seems straightforward. But the question that I have, and kind of follow me in this little journey here. Not long ago, we celebrated Passover. And in Passover, we read the story of the parting of the Red Sea. And in the Song of the Sea, we say, I will sing to the Lord. The horse and its rider he has hurled into the sea. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he casts into the sea. They sank like a stone. They went down like lead in the mighty waters. So here, in this story of the Song of the Sea, we see that Moses is celebrating the downfall of our enemies. Maybe you know that famous teaching from the Talmud that when the Red Sea was parted, the angels wanted to sing, but God said to them, the works of my hands are drowning in the sea, and you wish to sing? It's a beautiful story from the Talmud in Sanhedrin. But this was said to the angels, who were not part of the miracle. The Israelites, the people for whom the miracle was performed, they sang, they rejoiced. The women led by Miriam even went out with their tambourines and they danced. Let me give you another example. On Purim, we celebrate the downfall of Haman, and we don't hide it. The Megillah explicitly describes how Haman and his sons were hanged. Towards the end of Megillat Esther, it says that we celebrate Haman's downfall and the miracle of our deliverance. The blessing recited after the reading of the Megillah says, blessed is he who avenges our cause and repays the enemies of our soul. There's a hymn, Shoshanat Yaakov, that's recited immediately after this blessing, and we add, cursed is Haman, who sought to destroy me. So, what exactly do we mean? What exactly did Shmuel the Small mean when he said, when your enemy falls, do not rejoice? We seem to rejoice every time, and it's the easiest way to feel that heightened sense of joy is to see the downfall of your enemy. Let's just put it bluntly. So, in order to really understand this, I'd like to give a little background. Who was this Shmuel the Small? They called him Shmuel HaKatan. Shmuel the Small was a Tana. He was a sage who was part of the academy in Yavne, in the first generation after the destruction of the temple. There was a gift that was given from Vespasian to Rabbi Eliezer, to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And that gift was to leave the sages in Yavne studying in Babylonia. And there's an interesting story that explains why this sage who was in Yavne, Shmuel the Small, why he was called this very funny name. Once Rabban Gamliel, who was the president of the Sanhedrin at the time, he was the president of the Jewish court, he asked for 7 of Israel's greatest sages to come early the next morning to discuss the need to add an extra month, the Adar 2, the leap year month, to the calendar, which is, right now we're in a leap year. The next morning, Rabban Gamliel found 8 people present instead of 7. He looks around and he says, "Who has come without permission? Let him leave." Shmuel the Small stood up and he said, "I am the one who came without permission. But I did not come to discuss the issue at hand, but to learn the practical law." He explained that he came not to be one of the 7, but he came as an apprentice. Rabban Gamliel responded, "Sit down, my son. You are worthy of declaring all the leap years." In truth, Shmuel the Small had been invited, but someone else came without an invitation. And to avoid embarrassing this uninvited person, Shmuel the Small took the blame upon himself. This act earned him the title of Katan, of the Small. Maybe this gives us an understanding of why this Shmuel the Small explained that when your enemy falls, do not rejoice. I've spoken about this before, but the sayings and the ethics of our fathers, they're not just good ideas or tweets that the rabbis would say in kind of like a quotable quote before it was popular to have a quotable quote or a tweet. These were ideas they lived by. This was a behavior that was reflected humility, that was the consideration of others, even in such complicated situations. But it's not so simple. In the prayer that we say 3 times a day, called the Amida, it's the backbone of all the daily prayers. It's also called the Shmona Esrei, which means 18, because originally this prayer contains 18 blessings. But if you count them, you're going to discover there's actually 19 blessings in this prayer. The Torah says that initially, Rabban Gamliel in Yavne, he put together 18 blessings, and they encompassed all the physical and spiritual needs of a person. But in the period following the destruction of the Second Temple, there were various sects that emerged within the Jewish people, such as the Sadducees and the Christians. Each of these groups denied different parts of the Torah and different narratives. And cases of informers and traitors within the Jewish community increased, and it caused a terrible suffering. Rabban Gamliel saw the need to add a blessing against these informers, to emphasize the severity of their betrayal and the danger of heresy amongst the Jewish community. Rabbi Gamliel asked the sages to suggest some suitable people to compose the prayer. Who did they choose? They chose this Shmuel the Small. It's a beautiful page in Brachot in the Talmud. We actually study this Talmud every Thursday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern on Zoom. And so we just study this Talmud. And it says that the blessing says, "For the slanderers let there be no hope, and may all the heretics and all the wicked perish in an instant. May all your enemies be swiftly cut down, and may you uproot, crush, cast down and humble the reign of wickedness swiftly in our days. Blessed are you, God, who destroys enemies and humbles the wicked. See, here we see that Shmuel the Small, who taught, when your enemy falls, do not rejoice, also vehemently opposed those who sought to undermine the foundations of Jewish faith, and prayed for the immediate downfall of those informers, of those heretics who caused great suffering to the Jewish people. And so, this is my quandary. How do we reconcile these ideas? How do we not rejoice in the downfall of others, but also see the wicked and the difficulties? Here's a thought. When it comes to the enemies of the Jewish people, like Haman, like Pharaoh, we have to pray for God to save us from them. And when God punishes them, it's our duty to rejoice. What Shmuel the Small advocated throughout his life is, when your enemy falls, do not rejoice, was not directed towards figures like Hitler. He was referring to the person who lives next door and annoys you on a constant basis, or the guy whose dog barks all night, preventing you from sleeping, despite your repeated pleas to him to do something about it. He stubbornly refuses to listen. Or the person who competes with you in business, who opens a spite store. Joking. I guess, who competes with you. Someone who's vying for the same customers, stealing your livelihood. Or that politician you deeply despise because you believe their views are destructive. In these kinds of situations, Shmuel the Small had in mind that when your enemy falls, do not rejoice, because lest God see and it displeases him. Because God cannot tolerate gloating that stems from personal vendettas, from malice, from cruelty. God can't stand gloating that stems from personal vendettas, from malice, from cruelty. I want to share with you a story that kind of illustrates all this. There was a follower of the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi, the author of the Tanya. He lived about 300 years ago. He was a wealthy man, and he was deeply involved in charitable activities. He was a great scholar and a person of exemplary character. His name was Reb Sender. Sender and his father were tea merchants in Russia. They would travel to Leipzig, Germany, where they met with their main supplier to negotiate prices and quantities. Afterwards, the goods would be shipped to the Russian border. In their town, there was a Jewish businessman who was hostile towards these Hasidim, towards these people, and envious of Sender and his father's success. He decided to start trading tea himself, and his envy led him to falsely accuse them of tax evasion to the authorities, aiming to become the sole tea merchant in town. Although Sender and his father conducted their business legally, a government investigation would likely uncover a minor administrative fault, something which could land them in very hot water. The competitor planned to inform the authorities about the tea shipment as soon as it crossed into Russia. He thought that the tea would be confiscated, causing Sender and his father to lose a significant amount of money and face criminal charges. Unaware of this whole thing, Sender travels to Leipzig as usual, and he pays a large sum up front for a substantial quantity of tea. Meanwhile, rumors spread in the city that the authorities were investigating the tea shipments and smuggling. A few days later, it became known that a complaint had been filed against a large tea shipment. Sender and his father, fearing that the authorities would unjustly confiscate their tea, decided to hide the goods in a secret location until the situation calmed down. Their plan succeeded, and the authorities did not seize the shipment. Instead, the shipment of the informer arrived, and that was confiscated. Actually, the scheme backfired like a boomerang, and the informer no longer had a livelihood, and he fell ill from stress. Many people felt pity for him, and they donated money to his family so they could live with dignity. Only a few knew of his malicious plan, including Sender and his father, but they never told anyone. Meanwhile, the tea of Reb Sender spoiled when it was in hiding, and they also incurred a significant financial loss. And subsequently, they decided to abandon the tea business. The informer's daughter grew up and reached an age of which in those days was called a marriageable age. He had no money to provide a dowry. One day, Sender visited the home, and when he entered, it was clear that the informer was trying to mutter something unsuccessfully. Nonetheless, he was very moved when Sender confronted him and urged him to trust in God. After Sender left the house, a bundle of money was found under the pillow, enough to provide a respectable dowry for his daughter. Sometime later, Sender himself passed away. Rabbi Shner Zalman, the Alter Rebbe, came to Shklov to comfort Sender's father and said to him, I see that your son's garments. He said, I see that your son has garments. I did not anticipate, meaning that his soul radiates with an exceptionally high spiritual light. The Alter Rebbe asked those present to tell him stories about Sender, and they recounted several stories. But the Rebbe was still not satisfied, and he requested more. When he heard the story of how Sender treated the person who caused him a significant financial loss, and how Sender repaid evil with good, he finally said, now I understand. I did not anticipate such garments. When can we celebrate the fall of the Iranian president? When can we celebrate the fall of evil? Hard. It's a hard question to answer. But this is what I know. So often we think of the other, the person who we don't know. There's an old joke about the difference between a Jew and an anti-Semite. I'm sure you've heard this one. An anti-Semite says, I hate all Jews. Oh, but what about Goldberg, your doctor? Oh, that one? He's amazing. He's wonderful. He's great. The Jew says, I love all Jews. But what about Reuben, your accountant? Ah, despicable, disgusting human being. It's very easy to talk about generalizing, to talk about all Jews or all evil or all good. The world has become so polarized, so black and white. It's hard to look at the person next door, the person who may be hurting you. When it comes to our neighbor, when it comes to our fellow, when it comes to somebody in our life, that's what Shmuel the Small was insisting. We should not rejoice in another person's downfall. And Hasidic teachings teach us to aspire to an even higher level, to repay good for evil. And this is what's expected. As difficult as it is, I'm going to continue thinking about it. I want you to continue thinking about it. I love to hear your thoughts about this idea, because it's so easy to live in a black and white or a groupthink world. It's hard to think critically, to think independently. Our world has become so fractured and so divided as a whole. But you and I, each of us, as a human, on an individual level, we're not. And we need to continue to inspire one another. We need to continue to think differently. May Hashem bless each and every one of you this week, that we should be able to celebrate, that we should be able to not celebrate the downfall of our enemies, heaven forbid, but to celebrate peace. May it be a week of peace, a week where we pursue peace and we live peace, and may there be peace in the world.